There are plenty of networking services that you as an IT professional need to know about, but what are networked hosts? Find out more next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to IT Pro TV's A Plus show. We are actually diving into this realm of different services that we'll actually see in networking, but also a new terminology that I'm not as familiar with, networked hosts. Wes, what are we talking about today?
You know, it is a very generic term, and it's used because we have a variety of devices that are connected to our networks that are providing services. A lot of times we really categorize these under servers, but interestingly enough, that in today's day and age, it isn't only servers that are providing services, roles, and functionality. It's a variety of devices, and that's what we're going to help you to identify in this episode.
All right, well, let's get started. Head on over to the bench.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, come on over here, and we're going to get started here, and we're going to talk about servers first, because, you know, the term servers is a little bit more recognizable than something generically like network hosts, right? That is more of an umbrella term that our servers fall under. And we have a few different types of servers, and one of the very first types of servers that I want to talk about in the service that it provides is what's known as a directory services server. Directory databases, these are the ways that we can store all of the objects that are in enterprise level networks. And I can show you here one of the common ones that we have today, one of the most popular ones in an enterprise level environment is what is known as Active Directory Directory Services. Active Directory Directory Services is a LDAP compliant directory service that allows us to create and store users. We can store computers. We can store all kinds of various objects, and scalable to a very large, the enterprise networks, if you will. So that's one of our very first services, if you will, amongst our network hosts that we need to talk about. It's one of the more important ones. It also forms what's known as an authentication server. It isn't the only type of authentication server, but Active Directory has multiple functionalities, and one of those is to be able to authenticate the users and computers that are connected to the network.
Now, Wes, if we're really just diving into this for the first time, where do we tend to find these types of directory services?
Oh, that's great question, Ronnie. You typically find these on enterprise networks, right? Unlike smaller networks, SOHO networks, small office, home office networks, they're typically 10 computers or less, right? They can have various mobile devices, but computer-wise, they're typically 10 or less. If you need more than 10, then Microsoft recommends you get what's known as an Active Directory domain and join the corporate or enterprise world.
Yeah, it actually gives us that centralized database that now we can actually say all authentication goes through that. But that's not the only type of server that we actually do have. So let's talk about mail servers for a moment as well. If there's anything that will stop a company, right, is if email stops here. So help us understand this a little bit better.
That's right. So we have a series of mail servers that we need to be aware of, right? What are we talking about when we say a mail server? Well, we're talking about sending electronic mail, abbreviated email. And like Ronnie said, it's one of the lifebloods of an organization's outbound communications. There are a few different roles that we need to be aware of. The very first one is what's going to be known as SMTP. That SMTP server, that's outbound communication. We also have another one, and that one is an oldie but goodie as well, and that's a POP3 server, the Post Office Protocol version 3 server, and that's for retrieving email, inbound email. And one of the more common ones that we use today, and you're probably using this if you have any kind of Gmail account, is what's known as an IMAP server, right? That's the Internet Mail Access Protocol. So 3 different servers, right? 3 different server types, if you will, but they're all fall under that email or mail server generically.
Now, when I first started working for a business, I was kind of surprised that we actually had to set all these things up. Actually, manually, some technician had to come over and actually go ahead and enter this stuff in. But as technology developed, a lot of this was as soon as I logged in my user account, it was set up for me. I didn't even have to touch anything, and I could get my email. It's actually pretty neat to actually get started there.
It most definitely is. Now, one of the things that's interesting, Ronnie, that we need to mention is another type of server that we really rely on for just finding about just any device within our networks and really across the backbone of the internet, right? And that's what's known as a DNS server, right? We are not shy of acronyms here within our episodes. DNS, if you will, is the domain name system, and I can actually show you kind of what that's a little bit about. DNS, if you will, it holds records for the computers that are within your network, if you will. It keeps track of it in a database, right? So the DNS server is a way that we can store all the records for the devices that are within the computers, if you will, that are within our networks. Generically speaking, remember that a DNS server, what it does is it provides us name resolution, taking those user-friendly, fully qualified domain names and allowing us to map them to IP addresses. A very important service, and one that you should have not only a familiarity with, but you should be able to work with and troubleshoot if you're getting into the IT industry.
Yeah, this is something, even though it feels like we're glossing over it a little bit, we are going to dive a little bit more into that, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the next one that we have to kind of look at is what's known as the DHCP server. And when we look at a DHCP server, the DHCP server allows us to dynamically push out configuration settings. And one of the most popular things that DHCP, or the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol server, does is it allows us to distribute, if you will, IP addresses to various clients within our network. So give you an example of this. When we talk about a DHCP server, a DHCP server is set up with what's known as a scope, if you will. Let me go ahead and bring up the DHCP server interface here. And within the DHCP scope, it's a range of IPv4, IPv6 addresses that we can lease out to clients that join our networks, and they ask, hey, I need an IP address out there. Is there a server out there on that network that's got one? Our DHCP servers respond and allows us the ability to ease the burden of manually assigning IP addresses across large enterprises, even small enterprises, and makes it our lives as administrators a little bit easier when it comes to IP addressing.
Yeah, this is actually one of those services that we really don't even think about, right? That's working in the background for us, that allows for easier management of anything that's happening on our networks by assigning those IP addresses and keeping track of them. Because if we end up with duplicate IP addresses, they're really going to actually conflict, and we're going to actually see a lot of error messages as well. Now, along with that, Wes, we also have file servers that we need to talk about.
We do, and one of the great things, you know, when we look at something like we're using Windows Server 2022 here, and one of the great things is by default, a lot of these servers come with some form of file and storage services already ready to go for us, right? And we can have volumes, we can add disks, if you will, we can aggregate more than one hard drive or storage device together and create a larger, what's known as a storage pool. Keep in mind that file servers in general, you might hear them generically say file share service, right? This allows us to put files and folders out on the network and then have clients connect to them and pull those files over the networks. We have some of the traditional ones like FTP servers. We have NFS servers, network file systems, if you're not in the Windows environment. If you're in the Windows environment, we have things like SMB, the server message block, that allows us to connect over to networks and gain access to the shared file resources across the network.
Yeah, so that actually is one of the more important things too, because we tend to, of course, generate a ton of different documents, files, whatever we might need. We want to, of course, make sure that they're saved someplace that could be easily accessible from wherever you're actually going to be. Now, the other part of that lifeblood that we were talking about, Wes, for a moment, we talked about email, but is the idea of printing. If somebody cannot print to the actual printer that's right there, people begin to get a little bit more upset. So tell us a little bit more about print servers.
Sure. Now, a print server is interesting because if you haven't seen a server before, servers can be very, very large and heavy devices that are typically in data centers. They can be smaller tower-based in smaller businesses, but that's what we tend to think of when we think of a server, a very, very powerful computer. But I want you to understand that print servers can be nothing more than the size of an average Apple TV box or a Roku box, right? Because it's the service that they're providing. I have the print management service actually set up on this server here because our server operating systems here can allow us to do print management as well. And one of the things that you can see here is that with a print management functionality where you have a print server, we can load up drivers, we can see the printers that we have already within our networks. I can do things like open the print queue, and if there were print jobs in here, I could modify those print queues. I could turn around and I could deploy these printers too, all from a centralized location. Now, if you are in a business that maybe you only have one printer, you might not need to go through through all of this. But if you're in in an enterprise level corporation where maybe you have multiple rooms or multiple floors within a building, and you have multiple printers that you need to be able to service, a centralized location to do that, like a print server, is the way to go.
Yeah, print servers are pretty much one of the more important things that affect the end user immediately. So if you actually do get calls, a lot of times it is because people will not be able to print. So it's something handy that you actually want to make sure that you do understand that concept of too. Now, Wes, here's a concept that's a little bit older, but it is something that people need to understand. Where in the world do we tend to find syslog servers?
Well, a syslog server, it's short for system logs, and syslog servers are typically something that we have inside of Nix-based systems. Now, Nix, I mean Unix and Linux-based systems, because in those systems they have what's known as a syslog service functionality, daemon if you will, that generates the system logs and stores them locally. One of the big things about these services that the network hosts are providing, you've heard Ronnie mention it, you've heard myself mention it, is it allows that centralized management. And that's what we want in large environments. So what we can do is we can set up a syslog server, and all your Unix and Linux-based systems can actually report over to that syslog server, and then an administrator of those systems can look in a centralized location to check all of the variety of system logs, if you will, across multiple devices in that single location.
Yeah, there's no doubt that all these are actually very important. Even though we don't tend to see how they work, we do actually end up seeing that they are working for us is what we want. Now, the front-facing side of a lot of businesses, though, are web servers. Help us out here, too.
Sure. So web servers, if you've been to our website at IT Pro TV and ACI Learning, you've come in contact with a web server. For instance, I've got the ACI Learning webpage up here, and what is actually going on here? Well, my browser actually generated a request and sent it out over the HTTP protocol, the Hypertext Transport Protocol, and said, hey, I want to connect and see that web page. Well, my browser connected to the ACI's web server, ACI Learning's web server, and pulled down that HTML and generated the web page. And that's what a web server it does for us, amongst many other things. It allows us to browse and view web pages when we connect to them.
Yeah, all these are actually good services that we should be fairly familiar with as an A-plus technician. And of course, as you continue to advance your career, you actually see that you need to dive a little bit deeper into this as well. Now, the other things that we can begin to talk about here are things like internet appliances. So Wes, what do we mean by that? What's an internet appliance?
So internet appliances, they can be very, very expensive. They can be a little bit generic too, but usually what we see in these devices is very, very expensive security-based devices. UTM, if you will, it's just short for the Unified Threat Management. That's an example of an internet appliance. Now understand that it's not a server, and that's why we use the term networked host, because it's connected to our networks. Now, we're going to go shopping with Ronnie's credit card here. And as you can see, that some of these devices get very, very expensive. These are something that is used within enterprise networks. Here you go, you got a UTM device, and it's about $200,000, right? So they get very expensive, but the concept is really what's important here. It takes multiple security functionalities and integrates it into a single component that you can manage in a centralized fashion, thereby making it a lot easier for us to manage some of our security infrastructure. Other ones that we have too, we have things like load balancers. And what a load balancer is, it's a way that we can distribute resource requests from some of those servers in our networks, if you will. We can take a load balancer, and when a client requests, we can spread that workload across multiple servers and essentially even out that workload, distribute it evenly, so that if one server is getting a little bit too overburdened, we can send those requests to multiple servers, making the performance and the user experience a lot better on the back end. So load balancers allow us to distribute a workload across multiple endpoints, or in this case, typically things like, for instance, servers. Now, speaking of web servers, right, one of the things that also kind of falls within the realm of a web server is what's known as a proxy server. Proxy servers are very good because what you can do is you can set a proxy server, if you will, like a web server, in between a web server and the client. When a client makes a request, the client doesn't actually go directly to the website like you just seen me with ACI Learning. What it does is it actually goes to a proxy, and then the administrator can centralize or can centrally manage what and who can gain access outbound to the internet. That's a proxy. A proxy sits in between a client's browser and the web server and makes requests on behalf of the client. The benefit for your administrators is they can control who can gain access to what through the proxy itself. So these are some of the internet appliances that I would be aware of, whether you're in a certification exam endeavor or even in a support role.
Yeah. So along with that, right, the very fact is like proxy servers, we tend to see them in certain contexts a lot more often than every context.
Sure.
So things like schools, we tend to see them because we want all the students to actually go to a proxy server and not directly out to the internet.
That's right,
too.
that's right.
Now, the other systems that we want to talk about here, and this may, you'll have to tell me, Wes, is a SCADA system?
I've heard
that
them said both SCADA and SCADA. I've heard them both.
Is that a networked?
That is a giant, I would say, massive collection of components, right?
Okay.
SCADA systems almost form their own, typically an isolated networks, and they are connected to, routable networks. But these are essentially, think of your control systems, your industrial control systems. Think of things like power plants, if you will, right? Large infrastructure that uses a variety of components to control different aspects like water pressure, if you will, power elements. These are large systems. And the SCADA, if you will, is the supervisory control and data acquisition. And what we need to do is we need to figure out the information from a variety of these sensors, if you will, remote telemetry units that are just sending wireless information and collecting it in a centralized location. And it allows us to view that information. This is typically done in these large systems that run things like power grids, if you will, not just power plants, water systems as well. Think of those type of utility services. These are very large systems, and you might run into them.
Yeah, a lot of times where we tend to see those are things that actually require like what you were talking about, the idea of the control of shutting off valves, turning them on, of doing that and ensuring that actually done across the entirety of a building or actually in the entire site if we wanted to.
Sure.
So they're programmable. They actually allow us to do that as well. Now, the other thing that you actually have here on our list is IoT. If there's a very vague term, it is the term IoT. Somebody beginning to kind of dive in A+, this may be a little bit questionable for them. They might have heard the term a lot, but may not know exactly what that means. Help us out here.
Sure. Internet of Things is a variety of devices that basically connect to the internet. You've probably seen some of these before. In fact, let me give you an example here. I've actually got pulled up on our screen one of the more common IoT type devices that we see today. For instance, like a Raspberry Pi, you might hear things like Arduinos. These are essentially boards that can be completely self-sufficient. A lot of times are very low powered devices, and they form networks together that mesh together and communicate. If you've seen things like home automation systems, that is an example, a big example, if you will, of IoT devices. These devices are numbering in the millions and millions, if not billions today. It is a large market of IoT devices. If you want your refrigerator connected to a network, that now becomes an IoT type device. Your, if you look at, like I said, these Raspberry Pis, if you look at Arduino boards, these various printed circuit boards that have basically small computers built into them. So the IoT devices are just a variety of devices, small devices that can be connected to our networks today.
Yeah, it's difficult for somebody that may come from like old school like we did, right, where everything plugs into a computer and then that device gets access to the network or actually does that. These devices, though, can stand independent alone, don't need another computer to actually make them work and to do all those different things too. So those are some of the different considerations that we have to think about as well. All right, Wes, anything else we need to talk about in this episode?
No, just one of the big things here is just to be able to, again, if you're in a certification endeavor, make sure that you can explain these and you understand what these devices are and some of the services that are provided for them, and that's also going to be beneficial if you are in a support role.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.